Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece for Reason to Resist on April 25th, 2026. Washington's European vassals are corking open the champagne after agreeing to flush another 90 billion euros down the Ukraine proxy war toilet. Today, we're going to discuss Europe's latest investment in defeat, as well as the newest developments in the West's war on Iran. But before we get into it, please remember to like and share this video if you find it to be informative. If you're not already a subscriber, please become one. We recently went past the threshold of 170,000. Our goal is to get to 200,000 subscribers by the end of this summer, and you can help us to expand the reach of our unapologetic resistance journalism by becoming a subscriber if you are not already one of them. Now, let's get into it. So 2 days ago, on April 23rd, the European Council announced that its member states had approved unanimously the legislation necessary to provide a new $90 billion support loan to Ukraine. And that is how they characterized it as a loan. And we'll return shortly to the question of whether that is a fair characterization of this financial assistance. For now, I want to highlight that it's in its announcement, part of which is up on the screen, the European Council stated, quote, "The loan will help cover the country's most urgent budgetary and defense capacity needs in 2026 and 2027 within a robust and conditional framework. Funding will be linked to strict conditions on Ukraine's side, such as adherence to the rule of law, including the fight against corruption." According to the Council, the financing will be made available in two ways. 30 billion euros for macroeconomic support to Ukraine to address Ukraine's most urgent budgetary needs. What that actually means is that Ukraine is on the verge of not being able even to pay its civil servants. And another 60 billion euros for Ukraine's capacity to invest in military industrial capabilities, including procurement of military technology and equipment. And the funding will give Ukraine access, said the Council, to military equipment from Ukraine, the EU, and other third countries. Undoubtedly, one of those other third countries will be the United States, although the European Council does not say so explicitly in its announcement. Understandably so, because after all, there's not a lot of excitement in Europe nowadays for the European taxpayer to enrich US merchants of death even more than they already have. Now, predictably, the Ukrainian dictator Volodymyr Zelenskyy was ecstatic. Here you can see Zelenskyy with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, as well as European Commission President Antonio Costa. They held a trilateral meeting in Lefkosia, the capital of Cyprus, on the day of the European Council's announcement. Again, that's April 23rd, 2 days ago. The Eurocrats were in Cyprus for a meeting of EU heads of state. The government of Cyprus, led by Nikos Christodoulidis, currently holds the rotating presidency of the European Council. Now, you might be asking why I refer to Zelenskyy as a dictator. Well, the answer is simple, my friends. His presidential term expired nearly 2 years ago in May 2024. And he continues to rule under martial law. Zelenskyy has stated repeatedly, even when pressured by the Donald to hold elections in Ukraine, that under Ukrainian law, he cannot hold an election during martial law. But what he conveniently ignores to mention is that he could temporarily lift the martial law for purposes of holding an election. He also ignores that many states, including the United States and Russia, have held elections in times of war. It's widely known and has been for a long time that Zelenskyy's regime is not only autocratic, but deeply corrupt. Last year, Ukrainian authorities charged 8 persons with bribery, abuse of office, and illicit enrichment in connection with a $100 million kickback scheme. And one of the persons charged was Timur Mindic, Zelenskyy's business partner. Shortly before he was to be arrested, Mindic was apparently tipped off because he escaped to, you guessed it, Israel, which readily granted him refuge. I wonder, by the way, who tipped Mindich off. Might it have been Zelenskyy or one of his surrogates? Now, as I mentioned, the European Council's April 23rd statement declared pompously that, quote, funding will be linked to strict conditions on Ukraine's side, such as adherence to the rule of law, including the fight against corruption, close quote. Now, if the EU cares so much about fixing corruption in Ukraine, why has it done nothing about Israel's decision to harbor the fugitive Timur Mindich? As far as I'm aware, von der Leyen, nor any other representative of the EU, has ever uttered a peep about the fact that Zelenskyy's business partner is evading justice by hiding out in Israel. Maybe that's because the Eurocrats don't want Mindich to tell Ukrainian authorities what he knows about Zelenskyy, but I'm just guessing. In any case, if the EU will do nothing to pressure Israel to hand Mindich over to Ukrainian authorities, no one should take seriously its pious pronouncements about corruption in Ukraine. Now, as I indicated, the EU is describing this funding as a loan, but the idea that Ukraine will ever pay this money back is a pipe dream. Ukraine's industry has been destroyed. Its economy lies in smoking ruins. It can't afford, as I mentioned, to pay its civil servants and requires foreign financial assistance to do so, just to keep the basic functions of the government going. Moreover, after the war began in February 2022, Ukraine defaulted on its debt and was forced to restructure its debt. The Eurocrats know, of course, that Ukraine's financial constraints are obvious to the whole world, so they've talked about using Russian central bank assets to pay off the loan. But if they were actually able, legally and as a practical economic matter, to seize Russian central bank assets in the range of about $300 billion, they've been held in a state of a deep freeze since the war began, pursuant to actions taken by EU governments and the US government. If they were able to actually confiscate those funds, they would have done so by now. And it's become quite clear that whether for practical reasons, in other words, freaking out investors around the world at the idea that their money can simply be stolen at any time by a fiat of the European Union, or whether it's they think that the courts will not allow them to get away with it, which is, I think, probably the primary reason for their failure up until now to confiscate those funds. The fact is that if they could have confiscated them, they would have done it by now. They haven't done it by now because they can't. And so they've begun waffling about the day when Russia will be defeated and it will consent to the confiscation of its $300 billion or thereabouts in central bank funds. Well, that's never going to happen, folks. Russia's never going to consent. It's not going to be defeated. There's absolutely no prospect of it being defeated. The very best that Ukraine could hope for, with huge amounts of additional support in the future, is some kind of a stalemate. It's never winning back its territory. And so what this really means is that eventually European taxpayers are going to end up footing the bill for this 90 billion euro quote unquote loan. The money will not be paid back, but Europe will have to pay back the institutions from which it borrows the money in order to assist Ukraine. And at that point in time, the payback is going to come directly from the taxpayers of Europe. So don't believe it for 1 second. This money is coming out of each and every European's pocket. Now, for a host of reasons, this so-called loan should enrage the citizens of the European Union. First, the EU is so financially constrained that it had to borrow the money. It is not able to give this assistance to Ukraine from funds it currently holds. And numerous EU states, particularly Greece, Italy, and France, are already indebted to an extreme and dangerous degree. Second, and as I mentioned, Zelenskyy and his regime are hopelessly corrupt. Third, there is no reasonable prospect, as I argued, that Ukraine will ever win this war or recover the territory it has lost. Finally, the EU is giving this massive aid to Ukraine at a time when the continent is being plunged into an economic crisis by the war on Iran. a war that was initiated in violation of international law by two states that are supposed to be allies of Europe, namely the United States and Israel. So why has this so-called loan not initiated mass protests across Europe? Have Europeans become so propagandized about the supposed Russian threat that they will allow themselves to be robbed blind by Ukraine and complicit European governments, particularly at a time when they're going to require massive financial assistance because of an economic crisis precipitated by the United States and Israel, one that was entirely avoidable? Have they become sheep? Now, I know that some Europeans listening to this broadcast today will share my outrage. And I know there are many more of us out there across the continent today. But apparently, our numbers are not great enough to cause European governments to refrain from acting in this latest act of kleptocracy, because that's exactly what it is. This is going to be used, this money, to enrich the military-industrial complex and the corrupt Zelenskyy regime, and will not do one damn thing of good for the people of Europe. And as a matter of fact, it's not going to do a lot of good for the people of Ukraine either. Now, before I turn to Iran, I want to comment on a couple of other aspects of these EU meetings in Cyprus. Not only was Zelenskyy invited to Cyprus, but so too were certain autocrats from West Asia. They included the dictator of Syria, al-Jilani. As you may recall, it was just last year that the CIA had a $10 million bounty on this terrorist's head, but now he is being warmly welcomed across the capitals of the Western world, most recently, as you see here, by the Cypriot president in Cyprus during the EU meetings this week. Al-Jilani, as you may recall, was responsible and the forces that he commanded for a series of atrocities across Syria. The state of Syria has continued to suffer enormously under his illegitimate regime. He has done absolutely nothing to force Israel to withdraw from territory it illegally occupies in Syria. And in fact, on his watch, the amount of territory that Israel has occupied in Syria has grown dramatically, which may explain the fact that he's become a veritable rock star in Western halls of power. Not only was this reformed terrorist warmly embraced by the Cypriot president, but so too were the autocrats of Egypt and Jordan, and the representative of the Gulf Cooperation Council, which itself is made up of some of the most vicious autocracies in the world. And for good measure, they extended an invitation to Cypriots also to the leader of Lebanon, Mr. Aoun. Now, after meeting with these autocrats, terrorists, and kleptocrats, European Council President Antonio Costa issued a statement, and it related to the war on Iran. And I just want to highlight here the third paragraph. Our priorities, he's talking here about EU governments, are equally clear. One, first, to restore freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. Second, to work towards a stable and lasting ceasefire that could pave the way to sustainable peace in the region. Third, and finally, there cannot be a stable Middle East with a nuclear-armed Iran, and the European Union will continue to contribute to this objective as it has in the past. There is not a word in this statement, my friends, of criticism of the United States or Israel, despite the fact that every sensible and objective international legal scholar in the world acknowledges that this war is a flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter. It is the crime of crimes as a war of aggression. That's what the Nuremberg Tribunal said about wars of aggressions, the ultimate evil. Not only is the war itself the ultimate evil, but the US and Israel have committed multiple war crimes, dozens and dozens of war crimes in Iran, in Lebanon, and are currently continuing to carry out a genocide in Gaza. And in fact, just a few days ago, Israel, during a ceasefire no less, murdered a widely admired Lebanese journalist, Kamal Khalil. And despite all of this, as I said, there is not a peep of criticism anywhere in Costa's statement about the conduct of Israel or the United States during this war of aggression. On the contrary, Costa is perpetuating the lie that Iran seeks a nuclear weapon. When he said there cannot be a stable Middle East with a nuclear-armed Iran, he is lending legitimacy, or trying to lend legitimacy, to the one of the justifications that have been given by the United States and Israel for launching this war of aggression, namely that Iran purportedly seeks a nuclear weapon. Costa doesn't mention the fact that Iran doesn't in fact have a nuclear weapon, that the United States and Israel have been claiming for decades that Iran was on the verge of obtaining a nuclear weapon, that the Iranian supreme leader issued a fatwa prohibiting nuclear weapons, a fatwa which to our knowledge has not been withdrawn, and most of all, that Israel itself possesses enough nukes to destroy the entire region and is the only state in West Asia that is not a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. All of that is omitted by Antonio Costa. So let's be very clear about this, folks. This is just one piece of evidence in a mountain of evidence that all of Europe is behind this war of aggression on Iran. I've said it before, I will say it again and again and again to make the message abundantly clear to anybody who will listen that this is not simply a US-Israel war of aggression on Iran. This is a Western war of aggression on Iran. It is being aided and abetted in a number of ways, not simply rhetorically, as for example in this statement, just as the genocide in Gaza is a Western genocide, not simply an Israeli genocide, not simply a US-Israeli genocide. Virtually every single Western country in one way or another, and oftentimes in multiple ways, has aided and abetted the genocide in Gaza. Now, another notable aspect of these meetings in Cyprus was discussion around the EU's mutual assistance clause. And here there is an excerpt from an article published 2 days ago by The Guardian, which says that the president of Cyprus, Nikos Christodoulidis, has called for a discussion on how to give substance to the EU's mutual assistance clause. Article 42.7 of the treaty, the EU treaty, obliges member states to provide, quote, aid and assistance by all the means in their power, close quote, to a fellow member that is a victim of armed aggression on its territory. Cyprus, which is not a member of NATO, wants the EU to take that clause more seriously after a drone hit a British base on the island in March. The clause has only been activated once by France after the Paris terrorist attacks of 2015, but many officials are unsure how it works in practice. So let's break this down, shall we? First of all, I don't believe there's ever been any admission by the Iranian government or military that it struck the Akrotiri military base on the south of Cyprus, from which I have reported on numerous occasions during the genocide, and I've documented how that military base has been sending huge amounts of weaponry to Israel and other military equipment during the genocide and during the wars on Iran. So let's be very clear. If in fact the Iranians struck that military base, that would not be an act of aggression. That would be an act of self-defense, because this military base is aiding and abetting a genocide in occupied Palestine and a criminal war of aggression on Iran on a daily basis, as a matter of fact. A fact that Christodoulidis, who is as pro-genocide a leader as you're going to find in the West, conveniently ignores in his public commentary. But as I said, the Iranian military, to my knowledge, has never actually admitted that it struck the Akrotiri military base. And one should not put it past Israel to have staged a false flag, or perhaps even some other European country, to try to induce the Europeans to enter the war on Iran directly and by committing their own military forces to some suicide mission, like, trying to clear the Strait of Hormuz. At the end of the day, what this pleading by the Cypriot president implicitly admits is that the British and the Americans, other Western powers who use akrotiri, are endangering the Cypriot people by using that piece of the island in order to perpetrate crimes against humanity and a war of aggression on Iran. That's exactly how the fine people of Cyprus should take this ominous plea from the Cypriot president to his fellow EU leaders. Now, in other news, Iran's foreign minister is in Islamabad, Pakistan today, and he's there to hold discussions about the ongoing war against the genocidal entity and the Epstein regime. And this, by the way, is part of a multi-stop tour that the foreign minister of Iran is doing. He's apparently also going to be going to Moscow on this trip. Now, upon learning of the Iranian foreign minister's trip to Pakistan, Trump promptly dispatched the arch-shysters Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner to Pakistan. And you'll notice here that The Guardian, from which I screenshotted this photograph and headline, uses the word hopes for renewed Iran peace talks. It associates hope with the arch-shysters Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. And in fact, The Guardian and other shameless Western media outlets began to speculate as soon as they learned that the Iranian foreign minister was in Pakistan and that these two con men were heading there, that a meeting between the Iranians and the Americans was about to take place and that direct face-to-face peace negotiations would be revived. Now, the corporate media, if you haven't figured this out yet, keep lying about the prospects for successful peace negotiations because they are freaking out about the looming economic collapse arising from the soaring price of oil and gas, and also the cutoff of other essential commodities such as urea for fertilizer and aluminum from the Persian Gulf. They're obviously aiding and abetting Trump's efforts to manipulate commodity markets and prevent the prices of key commodities from rising to unmanageable levels. They do this even when the Iranian government states that it does not plan to meet with the shysters or other representatives of the Epstein regime. And in fact, that's precisely what the Iranian foreign ministry did today. The spokesperson of the foreign ministry issued a statement a few hours ago, or this would have been yesterday, I should clarify, stating, "We arrive in Islamabad for an official visit. FM Arakshi will be meeting with Pakistani high-level officials in concert with their ongoing mediation and good offices for ending American-imposed war of aggression and the restitution of peace in our region. No meeting is planned to take place between Iran and the U.S. Iran's observations would be conveyed to Pakistan." So let's be very clear. The Strait of Hormuz remains essentially closed. It remains fully in control of the Iranian military. And as long as the U.S. blockade on Iranian ports continues, and as far as we know, Trump has maintained it in place, even though it hasn't been entirely successful, to put it mildly, in stopping Iranian cargo ships from transiting out of the Strait of Hormuz. Nonetheless, it is impeding to some degree activity to and from the ports of Iran. That is an act of war. That is a violation of the ceasefire. And therefore, we can anticipate that there will be no peace negotiations, certainly nothing face-to-face, nothing rising to the level of seriousness that would give us cause for optimism as long as the embargo, or the blockade, I should say, remains in place. Now, finally, it is being reported that the U.S. aircraft carrier George W. Bush is either arriving in the waters near Iran or has already arrived there. We are being told by the U.S. military that it is now within the area of operation of CENTCOM, which covers West Asia. Whether they're telling the truth or not, that's unclear. But one thing is for sure, the George W. Bush is approaching the region, and if it hasn't already arrived there, it is likely to do so very shortly. Interestingly, the George W. Bush had the option of traveling to the region through the Red Sea, but elected to avoid another clash with Yemen's Ansar Allah, and instead took the far longer route around the Horn of Africa. In any case, there are now 3 U.S. aircraft carriers in the region. One of them, the Gerald R. Ford, is reportedly in the northern Red Sea after having to undergo extensive repairs due to a rather devastating fire in its laundry room, or at least that's what we were told about the reasons for the repairs. And I think it's been a good 20, 30 years since the United States had 3 aircraft carriers in the region at once. That is obviously not a good sign. I would say and have consistently said that once these military assets have been deployed at great expense and effort by the US military, the temptation to use them will almost certainly be overwhelming. And I would imagine that Trump has already made the decision to do just that. And certainly that appears to be the opinion of the Chinese government, because today, or yesterday, I should say, the Chinese government issued an ominous warning. It again urged its nationals to exit Iran immediately, citing security risks. And as noted in this article from Turkey Today, Chinese authorities had already issued a similar evacuation warning on February 27th, just one day before US and Israeli strikes on Iran began the current escalation. My thoughts and good wishes and solidarity to the fine people of Iran as they face another onslaught from this criminal Epstein regime. But I remain as convinced as ever that even if the Americans go down that route, they will ultimately suffer an ignominious defeat. And sooner or later, Donald Trump is going to have to pay the piper by making major concessions to the Islamic Republic of Iran. For now, that's my report. I just wanted to add one other thing, information which may be of great interest to our audience, and that is that about an hour ago, I had the privilege of interviewing the foreign minister of Yemen and the acting foreign minister, and we had a long and fascinating discussion about the closure of the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, the possibility that that might happen, Saudi oil exports through the port of Yanbu on the Red Sea. We talked about the question of whether Israel has been strategically defeated, the reluctance of the US Navy to take on Yemen, and much more. We are hoping to be able to publish that interview tomorrow, Sunday, April 26th, assuming we can get the translation done in time. It'll be up on our website within the next 24 hours or so. For now, I'm signing off from Kalamata, Greece, for Reason to Resist on April 25th, 2026.